So hello everyone and welcome to Bouncing Forward, Learned Hopefulness in Challenging Times with Dan Tomasulo PhD, the first of hopefully many programs co-hosted by Westboro Connects and the Westboro Public Library. We would like to thank the Civic Club for their generous donation that helped make this program possible. Many of you have probably not seen me before. I'm actually the new adult services librarian at the library. My name is Megan, and I look forward to getting to know all of you a little bit better as I settle into this new position. I want to quickly go over the format for this event before I introduce our speaker. If you will be using closed captioning, please check the chat for instructions. We're also asking that everyone remain muted for the entire event. There will be a time for Q&A at the end, and if you'd like to submit a question at any time, you could please use the chat, and our volunteers will compile your questions to submit to Dan at the end of the program. If you'd like to submit questions anonymously, there is also a link to a Google form in the chat for that. Finally, we invite you to have your cameras on or off for this presentation, whatever you find the most comfortable. So for our speaker, Dr. Tomasulo is the academic director and core faculty at the Spirituality Mind Body Institute, Teachers College at Columbia University. He holds a PhD in psychology, MFA in writing, and a Master of Applied Positive Psychology from the University of Pennsylvania. He is internationally recognized as a leader in the field of positive psychology and hope, and a review editor for Frontiers in Psychology, Special Edition, Positive Psychology. His book, Learned Hopefulness, The Power of Positivity to Overcome Depression, has been endorsed by both Deepak Chopra, MD, and Martin Seligman, PhD. We are so excited that he was able to join us tonight to share information on a topic we all felt couldn't come at a better time. Welcome, Dr. Dan Tomasulo.
Thank you so very much. I'm going to share my screen so that we can begin. And is that up there? If I can get a thumbs up from folks? Yes, great. So let me begin by saying there are some sobering numbers I want to begin with. And we're going to talk throughout today about how you can get more hope in your life and more resilience and more joy. Later on, I'm going to be doing a measure on something called menti.com. If you have a cell phone handy or another opening on your browser, we can actually all be together on one slide. It's really kind of fun. I use it in my classes and the students love it. And I thought I would bring it here today for a test drive. So it'll be on menti.com and you'll get that information a little later on in the presentation. But the sobering numbers, putting things in perspective, this is all research that has come out prior to COVID-19. And I start with the negative stuff because we're going to build, as a positive psychologist, I've learned if you start with the positive stuff, it's hard to maintain it. But we start with this and we see kind of like what we're up against. And when you look at these numbers, 80% of people with depression relapse, 40% of Americans are lonely. You start to realize that there has been a dilemma before COVID, but every single one of these numbers has mushroomed, has grown tremendously since COVID. So that means we need to bring some new tools to this setting to try and understand what it is that we can do. And one of the reasons I became fascinated with hope is that we can point to a lot of different reasons for why things are in such a difficult place. But the number one reason is that people are losing hope and meaning, and they're losing it faster than at any other time in history. So we need new tools. And the new tools, thank goodness, work just like the heliotropic nature of a flower. A flower can withstand all kinds of harsh weather. You can have a horrible storm, and afterwards, when the clouds clear, the flowers naturally, organically turn toward the sun. We're built the same way. And part of what I'm hoping to do today is give you a little bit of the science and a little bit of the background about how this works. But first, we're going to start with your tongue to understand how all this works. I usually start my lectures off with a really elaborate picture of how your tongue looks inside your brain. So I typed into Google, tongue brain. I was looking for Google images. This is the first one that came up, and I thought, oh, it wasn't exactly where I was going, but I'm going to use this one. Have you ever caught something in between your teeth, like a piece of celery or a piece of meat or something like that in between your teeth? Where does your tongue go? Your tongue goes over there and it spends the rest of the day over there. If you bite your lip, where does your tongue go? It goes there. You burn the roof of your mouth, as we often do with pizza here in New Jersey. Your tongue goes up there to try and soothe it. The default mechanism of the tongue is to sweep the inside of your mouth looking for problems. Our brain is built exactly the way our tongue is built. We have something called a negativity bias, which means that we're going to pay a lot of attention to something if it's wrong. If you see a woman helping a man cross the street because he needs physical help, you might notice that and be warmed by that, elevated by that. But if somebody is starting an argument with a policeman who has just given that person a ticket and they're escalating and yelling, that is going to hijack your brain. So our brain's organization is built in a very particular way that we have to go up against in order to understand how to transform it, how to shift it. So this might seem rather simplistic, this idea that if we make a change in our emotions, that it'll have an impact on our thoughts, and the any change in any one of these three will have an impact on the other. But they're all influenced by one thing, that's our beliefs. So today we want to unpack a little bit about what beliefs are. Where do they come from? How do they operate inside of us? And most importantly, how can we transform them? So with this understanding of the negativity bias, we realize that negative emotions by definition restrict us. If we're being chased by the tiger, we don't worry how good our hair looks, right? Everything gets blurred out except for the thing that we're most frightened of. And it boils down to two primary emotions. You've probably heard about this, right? Fight or flight. But in the new science of positive psychology, we've learned that if you can build positive emotions, they build resources. And positivity ends up being one of the ways that we can transform a negative emotion into a positive. Now, what that means is that we have to put the brain at the service of your heart. And that is what results in positive interventions. So the question becomes, why positive interventions? And that's an easy answer, because not being depressed isn't the same as being happy. What I mean by that is that if we look at the history of psychology, we've only focused on alleviating suffering. And I have nothing against alleviating suffering, but it's only half the job. If 80% of people with depression are relapsing, it means that if we alleviate the suffering, they come back to a 0 point. And then in a very short period of time, they relapse. They go back to not feeling good. So we need positive interventions, because being okay doesn't mean that you're thriving. It means you're okay. So we need new tools, new science that helps us understand how this works. So I hope you'll allow me to show you some images that will challenge our way that we perceive. And we go all the way back to William James for this, right? My experience is what I agree to attend to. So if you keep that in mind, let's take a look at this image. This is a standard stock image, but if you look all the way over to the far right, what you'll notice is that the image is that of a rabbit. But if you let your attention go over to the far left, the same image becomes a duck. And what's interesting about this is you can move your eyes back and forth and start to notice that where you focus your attention will create your experience. And that's what William James was talking about. Now, if you would, just follow this along with me. If you look at the ridge on this mountain on the very, very top, I'd like you to check out and see if it's an accurate reflection in the lake below. Now, as you're doing that, I've asked you to focus on one aspect of this image, but if you'll again indulge me for a moment, put your left ear on your left shoulder and turn your head so you're looking at the image. And what you'll notice is to the far left is the head of an adult in prayer pose. The mountains are now really his shoulders, as is the reflection. And you'll see the head of a child in prayer pose. This is usually, by the way, when the dean comes into my class to evaluate me. My students are all kind of like this, and they're in Tomasulo's class. We need to challenge our perceptions. This looks like a catastrophe about to happen, but instead, it's actually a work of art. So, challenging perceptions and how they work ends up being the cornerstone of our capacity for regulating perception, right? We can challenge them. I'm going to let this one run twice. Most people like to see this again, right? It looks one way, but in actuality, it is something very, very different than what we originally thought.
Mm.
This happens over and over again. We make errors in assumptions about how things are. Now, rather than this just being sort of a parlor trick, I'd like you to see how we can apply this in science. By the way, I am in the Positive Psychologists Union, and I am required to show this for 30 seconds during every presentation. No, that's a bad joke. I'm sorry. Um, this glass is completely full, half
Yeah.
with water, half with air. But if I were to ask you the question that normally goes with this, I've restricted your thinking just by making you think that you only have two choices. So, learning how to look at things from a very different perspective is what we're going to do. We need to challenge our perception in order to evolve. Now, most of you, I can see most of you here, have started to tilt your head a little bit to the left, right? Well, you've not seen this image before, but in the very few seconds that we've been doing this work, you've already learned to challenge your perception. That's what I'm after. That if I can show you that things aren't set in stone, that we can see them differently, we start to challenge the way we're looking at things. And that gives us the capacity to do this, to see things in more than one way simultaneously. I have a dear friend who teaches fourth grade, and at the end of every semester when they were in school, she would invite me, and I have hundreds of these images. And this is always the one that I end on. And the last time I was in, I was showing all these images, and I leave this at the end, and a fourth grader jumped up in the back of the class. He goes, "You're blowing my mind." So good. We get the kids started early thinking about this. So I've written a book that came out last June, and it's called Learn Hopefulness, The Power of Positivity to Overcome Depression. And most of what you're going to hear today has to do with the research that went into developing this book. And it seemed to come at a very important time in the history of humanity. And I'll share with you some of the things that went into developing this idea of learned hopefulness. I originally started out by looking at all the different theories on hope, all the different research. And I thought it was going to be me choosing one of the theories that was the best one. But as I started to look at it and I saw what the medical people were doing, the social psychologists, the clinical psychologists, the educators, the business people. Everybody was doing research on hope, but it's like the parable of the three blind men who grab hold of the elephant, and each one grabs a part and then tries to describe the whole thing. The one who grabs the tail says it looks like a rope. One grabs the leg, says it looks like a tree. And the one who grabs the trunk says, of course, it's a snake. And instead of trying to pick one theory, I said, what if they're all right, but they just have different parts of it? What would hope look like? And this became a working definition for it. It's the regulation of perception toward belief in control of the future. Now, that's intriguing because what we're going to learn about hope is that it has to do with our mindset, our way of thinking about what's to come. There's a lot of other theories, other things that fit in here, but at the end of the day, we're trying to regulate our perception toward belief in control of the future. Everything boils down to this. If somebody said, what is this whole theory and practice about? It's about learning how to move toward the conflict. When you see something, feel something, experience something that sets you back, the idea is not to shut down, but to find ways to move toward that conflict. So I thought what you might appreciate is where this came from. And this grew out of a lot of work on what's called resilience. And we go all the way back to Norman Garmezi, who really did a terrific job because he wasn't just looking at the pain, he wasn't just looking at the suffering. He started asking questions of educators. Can you identify stressed children who are making it here in your school? Now, this is like the 80% of people who relapse with depression. Instead of studying them, it'd be like studying the 20%. What makes people resilient? What makes them bounce forward? What gives them that stamina? This is what he was really asking. Let's take naturally resilient kids and find out how they're put together. This was followed by a developmental psychologist, Emmy Werner. She studied nearly 700 children. And what she realized when she started looking at the children who were tremendously resilient is that the experience is not inherent in the event. It's inherent in your psychological perception of the event. Now, that's a powerful, powerful statement because as she studied the resilient children, she realized they had all of these characteristics. They were autonomous. They met the world on their own terms, right? They had this internal locus of control. They were the orchestrators of their own fate, and they had really strong sense of a spiritual connection. They had this internal sense that they were being guided, that something was supporting them from the inside. And this is research now that has been followed up. Right? We have George Bonanno, perhaps the leading researcher on resilience, and he's created an idea from all of this research and certainly all the tremendous work that he's done of something called a potentially traumatic event. I want you to think about that with me for a minute. It doesn't mean that an event in and of itself is traumatic. It has the potential to be traumatic. It is how we deal with it that becomes much more important than the event itself. And if we follow this up with other researchers who have created paradigms and ways of reframing an initially negative event into a positive. In other words, the scientists are getting on board now with this idea that transformation is possible, and not only possible, it's likely if you can develop the skills. I've worked for Marty Seligman for the last 10 years as his assistant. I was lucky enough to be the first psychologist to go through the program. It was not meant to be a retraining program for psychologists, but I think because I had a background as a writer and as a psychodramatist, I remember when I asked Marty, why'd you let me in? He said, you're not a normal psychologist. That's kind of how he talks. So I'm not sure if that was a compliment or a dig, but he kept me on as a student and then afterwards hired me as faculty. Marty was the person that you might have heard about in Learned Helplessness. And I'm going to show you some of that work in a minute. But he is also the one that gave us learned optimism. And obviously, because I was so close to him and his work, I said, I want to write about learned hopefulness. And that's where, he gave it its support because it really seems to be the next phase. So I want to talk a little bit about his original research, just so that you get a good frame of this and show you the things that have come from it. But his mentor was Jonas Salk. So in the day of vaccines, it's important to know about inoculation because Marty really wanted to do psychological immunization, right? And this idea that there was an uncontrollable bad event, and if we had a perceived lack of control in that event, that we would generalize that to another event where we shouldn't have felt that at all. So, in other words, if we feel we can't do something, and then we go to another arena where we can do something, we're still going to feel helpless inside. But he and another researcher, Steve Mayer, had been tracking this for the 50 years it's been since they learned helplessness. And they found out that they were wrong. And very few people are aware of this, that the learned helplessness paradigm wasn't about learning at all. It seemed that when we're exposed to chronically difficult situations, there's an evolutionary button that shuts us down. Just like we have a negativity bias, we have a loop in our brain, actually called the hope circuit, that will shut us down if the situation looks like we can't get out of it, to conserve our energy. And why would it do that? It's doing that so we have the chance to use that energy for risk assessment in the future so that we can take a look around and see, is there a way I can change my behavior to get a little bit of control in the future? Carol Dweck was directly influenced by the original paradigm, learned helplessness, and you, I am certain, know of her work with mindset, right? And this idea of mindset, she's talking about what we can do to change the way we're thinking about the future. That's important. This is about the future. And she's big on the word yet, right? That I can't do it. I can't do this yet. You start anticipating how you can perceive the future. This becomes a really important paradigm for us taking greater and greater control in our life. So in this, we see an evolution, a team of researchers from around the world who are doing this. And I've just picked a couple of the superstars here so that you can see what's been happening. And Dr. Lisa Miller, who's the founder of the SMB program that I'm now the academic director of, she's done incredible research to find out what is the strongest thing that we can do in order to have some kind of protective element against depression, against drug use, against risky behaviors. And it tends to be when adolescents start to have a relationship with the transcendent, some connection, not a religious one per se, but some connection inside. It's as though they've learned how to internalize this source of resilience. This brings us to a few concepts that I think are important because there are several myths that are around hope that I'd like to challenge and give you some tools to think about. So when a change is upon us, instead of just seeing the change as something we have to deal with, it is also something that gives us a chance. We start to notice again that people who have tremendous resilience and bounce forward don't just see something happening to them as a fait accompli, something that's done. They see it as a chance for them to have a different response. And what that means is that hope is a verb, that you need to do something about it. So this is the old definition of hope. And what I'm hoping for, no pun intended, is not to want something to happen, but to make something happen, and not to wait for it, but to do the things that are going to help you cultivate a response toward it. So there are five myths about hope, and I'd like to cover these for a moment. The first myth is that hope is a purely positive emotion. Well, as you'll come to learn, it's the only positive emotion that requires negativity and or uncertainty to be activated. Think about that for a moment. Of all the positive emotions, joy, bliss, gratitude, all of these things, they don't need anything to jumpstart them, right? But hope needs uncertainty or negativity. Think about that for just a moment. If we didn't have uncertainty about our future, there would be no reason to hope, right? So now what we're looking at is the raw material necessary for transformation. So if you're going to activate hope, it means that we need something uncertain or negative in order to jumpstart it. The second myth, hope influences our belief system. Actually, it's the other way around. Our beliefs influence hope. And by the way, that has to do with placebos, right? If you see how drug companies do their studies, what you learn is that they have to go up against the placebo effect, right? How powerful our thoughts are. We get something that has no active ingredient at all for the disease or the condition that we're trying to cure. And yet if people believe that they're taking it, we're going to see tremendous improvement. And in fact, some new light on the research shows that most of the studies that get done by the drug companies can't beat the placebo effect. Our beliefs are incredibly powerful. But then something fascinating happens. They become bidirectional. What that means is if I have a belief that I'm controlling something and this thing gets better or gets controlled, it supports my belief. In other words, our beliefs influence how we act in the future, and then that change comes back and influences, strengthen our belief system. Hope is the same as faith. Well, actually, it's not. Hope is when we feel we can have a positive impact on the future. Faith is when we've surrendered that to something greater. The great pitcher, Catfish Hunter, when he was inducted into the Hall of Fame, spoke about everything that he did in order to be in good shape, to practice in all different kinds of weather, to take care of his arm, to train during the off season. He talked about this. He says, but at some point, I have to let go of this ball. And I don't have any more control, but I'm going to do everything I can up to the point I let go. And I think that's a great definition for hope. When the book first came out, I was invited, believe it or not, to speak at St. Patrick's Cathedral. I mean, what a memory, what a tremendous joy to talk about the difference between hope and faith. And I found this quote, which I think is such a perfect blend between the two. Hope is faith holding out its hand in the dark. Once you realize that there's an overlap there, you have to be doing everything you can until you let go of that ball. That's really the point that we want to emphasize. Do what you can do to control it, and then let go. The myth number four: hope is regulated by circumstance. Actually, it's regulated by calibration. Um, and in order to demonstrate what I mean by that, I'm going to talk about a story that I have permission to talk about. It's a woman I worked with well over 25 years ago, arguably, but quite likely one of the most depressed people I've ever worked with. And her husband had left her quite suddenly, and she was really, really upset about it. And the communications broke down. It was a nasty divorce, and she had eventually, little by little, become a shut-in, kind of cutting off her friends and family and just kind of staying in the home. In fact, the only time she came out was for therapy, and she came to every session, was always on time. But I really started to wonder about my skills as a therapist because she wasn't getting better. She wanted nothing to do with medicine, and yet she showed up for every session. But about maybe 3 or 4 months into it, she was late, very unlike her, and she had about 10 minutes late. And she came in, she had a package of paper plates under her arm, and she says, "Oh, I am so sorry, but I had to stop at the store for paper plates, and there was a long line. I had to wait online, but I'm really sorry, and I just just got here now. And I was already a budding optimist back then. And I was like, oh, paper plates. That's great because that means you're going to invite friends over for some cake and coffee and stuff like that. And she was like, no. And I said, well, maybe your family. You're going to invite your family over and have the paper plates so you can clean up easy. She was like, haven't you been listening for the last couple of months? And I realized that I was kind of off track with the whole thing. And so I asked the obvious question, what are the paper plates for? And she said, I've run out of dishes. And in my perfect intervention, I said, what? And she says, I've run out of dishes. I have a little bit of breakfast on one part of the dish, and then lunch I have on another part, and maybe a snack later on. And when the dish is all dirty, I go on, I get another dish. And so I said, "Well, why don't you wash one dish?" And she got very angry. She said, do you think me washing the dishes is going to help me? And you think that's going to bring my husband back, going to change my situation? It is going to do nothing. Why should I bother? Just buy paper plates. So we had an argument. And for the rest of the time, I begged, I pleaded, please, between now and next week, wash one dish. And she wouldn't do it. She was dead set against it. Finally, very reluctantly, she agreed to wash one dish. Well, that night I got a call and I can still remember her voice. She was so animated. She was like, I can't believe it. I washed one dish. I felt great. I felt terrific. Then I washed another dish and another dish and another dish. And I washed all the dishes. Then I started cleaning the closets. I'm now down here in the base. I'm working down here. I'm cleaning things up. I feel so much better. When she finished up therapy, she brought me in a package of paper plates as a gift. She says, I want you to remember where my turning point in therapy was. Well, I certainly did all these years later because it was calibration. She couldn't control anything else in her life, but could she control that one dish? You bet she could. And she washed that. And what that did is it started that bi-directional thing. The minute you see the result of something that you've done, it spurs you on, it fills you up, and it starts what Barbara Fredrickson has called an upward spiral. So myth number 5, you either have hope or you don't. Well, it actually is that hope can be activated, regulated, and facilitated by positivity, which means if you can start just a little bit of positivity in your life, what begins to happen is it creates a desire for more and more and more of it until you start an upward spiral. So let's talk a little bit about that moment when you're hit with something that's overwhelming. And you have to make that decision. Is this going to be a downward spiral or an upward spiral? It was John Kennedy who brought this idea of the Chinese symbols to us, right? That this is the symbol for crisis, which is a combination of symbols, right? And danger and opportunity are infused with this idea. And what that means is that there's an incipient moment. There is a moment that we have to decide how we're going to respond. Is this a dangerous moment or is this a moment of opportunity? When we get to that, we start to realize that other people have spoken about this through time. The difference between what they've spoken about and what we're doing now is that our interventions are based on the science to show what you can do at that incipient moment. And this is the cornerstone of the book that in studying people who have high hope, I found that there are 7 decisions that they're making. And in order to appreciate those 7 decisions, I thought we could walk through them now. By the way, lots of the articles and things I've written and the first couple of chapters of the book and other information at the end of the presentation, if you text hopeful to 44222, you'll be able to get a direct link to all those articles and stuff. Um, uh, at the core of a decision is the fact that if you don't make a decision, if you decide not to change, you're making a decision not to change. So let me let that sit with you for a moment. In this moment, if people repeat a mistake, they repeat a downward spiral, they repeat a negative thought, that's not a passive event. A decision not to change is a decision to remain the same. Let me repeat that. A decision not to change is a decision to remain the same. So, what we're finding with high hope people is that when they come to a crisis, when they come to a change, they see a chance, they see something that they can bring to the situation that um, allows them to get a little bit of control in the future. The first thing is they, just like what Carol Dweck would be saying, right? They don't see things as fixed and unchangeable. People with high hope see possibilities. They focus on what opportunities or challenges can come from a difficult circumstance. So it's not just that something negative has happened, and this is all the research that George Bonanno's done and others have done, that it's our response to what happens, not what happens, that becomes important, right? So, if you would, I'm going to give you a little taste of this, and this will require you to write things down. So, if you would take a minute and just grab a pen and paper or on your cell phone or on a screen, just write these things down. And I'm going to give you a full minute. And I'm going to ask you to write down everything you did yesterday, right? So I'm going to start the clock now. I'll mind the time and write down every single thing you did yesterday. It does not have to be in order, but you do need to write down everything. Everything you did. You got up, you brushed your teeth, you went back to bed. Whatever it is that you did, write it down. About half the time is gone. Again, as quick as you can, everything that you did yesterday. Terrific. You've got about 10 seconds left. And please write down the last thing. Now, if you would, put that list out of your field of vision, turn it over, or go to another screen. Now, what I'd like you to do is look at the same yesterday you just looked at, but I'd like you to look at it through the lens of gratitude. And I want you to find 3 specific things that happened yesterday you have gratitude for. 3 things you have gratitude for. So think about that for a moment. 3 things that you have gratitude. So yesterday might have had a dozen things that didn't go well, but I'm asking you to pluck the 3 of them. I'm going to give you a minute for this one too. And please write them down. What you're in the middle of doing is changing the way you look at things. I'm going to give you another 15 seconds, and please, please write it down, because I'd like to show you something as we finish this up. So please write down the last thing you're about to write. And right now, your day just got better. Why did it get better? Now, if you look at the 2 things, the first one activated what we call the default network of your brain. In other words, when we're just making lists of things and thinking about things, we don't necessarily give a high valence to positivity. Those good things were there, but we might not have even mentioned them. If you look at that first list, about half the people didn't even have the gratitudes on that first list. They had all these other things. It depends on how you look at it. The minute you look at it, right? The minute you look at it through the lens of gratitude, you see things just like in the mountain and reflection in the water. You see things that were there, but you didn't notice them because you paid attention differently, right? And in this brief exercise, we actually activated three different types of gratitude. A cognitive strategy, right? That's your memory. How did you remember yesterday? It was filed in the file of things done. Not good, not bad. You didn't look at all the positive things that were there. You just looked at the things that you took care of, no emotion. But we looked at it through the lens of gratitude and saw it differently. Then we looked at you writing it down, right? The minute you take an amorphous emotion like gratitude and express it, write it down, it has to get filtered through your frontal lobes because when you go to write it in whatever language you're using, you got to use more of your brain. And I ask people all the time when I do a workshop, I say, "Do you have gratitude?" They go, "Oh yeah." Well, how much gratitude you got? A lot. Oh, okay. Because it's this big globby feeling. We don't even know, what to do. But when I ask specifically, can you write down three things you have gratitude? Boom. They're able to do that because now they're able to not only find it, but now express it, and that makes it richer. And if we had the opportunity to do it, as we sometimes do in workshops, we're able to share it with one another because what we start to find is that when people share their gratitudes, there's an upward spiral that goes with it, a really positive vibe that you get. Don't you know that, right? Aren't there people that they're just this buoyant spring of light and they come into your life and you feel it when they're there, you feel that energy, right? Sometimes I see at a party and I don't know a lot of people and I'll see people coming through the door and I'll think, oh, you can see the vibe of that person. I'm from Jersey, but I use the vibe word when I'm in California, right? They come through, they got this vibe. And then you see right behind them is Darth Vader. And it's like, oh, wait. When you're expressing something positive and good, what happens is it radiates out. Other people pick up on it. They actually call that sociodynamic energy. But we can measure all that, right? Second thing is that high hope people intentionally focus on beauty, benefits, and blessings instead of concentrating on the negative. So let's take a real good look at this. If you wouldn't mind, I'm going to invite you to indulge me again and close your eyes and think about a lemon. And I'd like you to see a lemon on a plate in front of you. Now, if you see that lemon in your mind's eye, I'd like you to try to imagine you smell just a hint of lemon in the air. And if you would, I'd like you to cut that lemon in half. And as you do, to see some of the lemon juice run out onto the plate. And if you would, pick up half the lemon and put it right under your nose and notice that the smell can be a little more intense. Now, what I'd like you to do is bite right into that half. Grind your teeth into that lemon. Now, if you're like most people, you produce saliva, right? I want you to think about this. There's no lemon, there's no plate, there's no life, there's no juice, there's no smell. And yet, you change the biochemistry in your body just with your thoughts. Can you imagine what happens when we ruminate with negative thoughts? It starts pumping cortisol out in our body. The people who won the Nobel Prize for telomeres, the little aglets on the end of our DNA cells, right, that hold them together, found out that one of the ways that they fray and make our cells age is with chronic negative thinking, that our thoughts directly influence our cells. And we just proved it here. How in the world could you produce saliva unless your thoughts were that powerful? So, a little piece of research, just a little something, right? What they found is that if you read 3 minutes of negative news before 10 a.m., think about that. It'll influence the entire rest of your day, 6 to 8 hours, because you started your day with negative news, right? Well, what we find out is that the reverse of that is also true. If you start your day with positivity, it has a ripple effect throughout the rest of the day. So if you would, I'm going to invite you once again to close your eyes and think of somebody you love and who loves you. And take a moment to feel what it feels like to be in their presence. And as you do that, you probably will feel a little tiny bit of warmth around your heart. That's because your vagus nerve is being stimulated, being activated, and oxytocin is being released. So you can start your day thinking of a loved one or thinking of a recent success, but it puts you on the right track in the beginning. People who score high on measures of hope cultivate positive emotions, right? In other words, they're searching. We call it hunt the good. They're looking for opportunities for good. Now, this is important because if you start with a negative belief, right, and it repeats itself, it'll pull you into a dark space. So, looking for good things is a way to keep you from moving into that negative thought. Now, a one off negative thought does not really hurt us. In fact, it's very organic and natural, and I wouldn't want us to try and stop negativity. If I'm coming up to the railroad gates and the train is coming and the gates are coming down, it's not a good time to be optimistic. Negative thoughts are important. But if we let them in and they repeat themselves, now we have an avalanche. In order to facilitate a transformation at that incipient moment, you start with a sentence. There's another way to look at this, followed by a question. What can I do to make change happen? When I showed you the mountain and the lake, and I invited you to use the sentence, there's another way to look at this, or I said that to you, it would start your brain trying to think of other ways to look at it, right? We're doing the same thing here. These two things back to back can start an upward spiral. People low in hope tend to give more attention to weaknesses. High hope people concentrate their effort on using strengths and spotting the strengths of others. So, for this, I'm going to ask you to take part in this exercise so you can see how it works. I'd like you to take a moment and think about a really positive experience, a peak experience in your life. Think about that. And I'd like you to think about where you were. Now, it might have only been a moment, literally a moment. It might have been a time in your life. It might have been this morning, it might have been 10 years ago. But think about this peak experience. And a peak experience is when uh, it, it was everything. It's the reason you were born, it's the ultimate feeling. Everything is operating on all cylinders. Please hold on to that image. Hang on to that thought for a minute. And now I'm going to ask you to look at this. Maybe one of the most powerful changes in psychology in its entire history has been the development of character strengths. So there is a website, but for right now, I'm going to encourage you to hold on to that image of that peak experience and find three of the strengths that you used during that peak experience. Was it your zest, your humor, your humility, your honesty, your creativity? Find the three and please jot those three down somewhere. What did you use during your peak experience? I'll give you a few seconds to do that. Okay. Now, you may not know this, but I've been taking a correspondence course on how to become an evil wizard. It's an online course. I've been doing extremely well. I'm really, and today, believe it or not, is my final exam. Yeah, I know it's surprising, right, that it fell right during our presentation. And as part of my evil wizardry training, they have taught me I have the ability to take away those three strengths. So I'd like you to think about this with me for a moment. What if I had the ability to take those three strengths, just those three, and prevent you from using them for a month? No, no, wait a minute. How about 3 months? No, I really want to get this certificate. An entire year. Supposing you could not use your three strengths for an entire year, I want you to think about 3 words to describe those feelings. Now I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Come on back here for a moment. And I'm going to do a couple of other things to get us ready. And I'm going to ask you to go to menti.com. Menti.com. And when you get there, you will find this screen and this number. So if you go to menti.com and use the code 5301 8764. Now, if this is being watched by the people on TV, you won't have the ability to do this. But everybody who's watching this right now, if you would, please go to menti.com, use the code 5301, and start putting in 3 words. You can put them one at a time, all the time, but you can put in up to 3 words. And let's see what happens when we take those strengths away. Angry, sad, upset. Thank you for that. Others, fearful. Good. Anxiety, panic. Look at this, right? Angry, resourceful. Anxiety, powerless, justice, challenging, sad, learning, hopeless. Notice the theme here. Notice what happens when your strengths are taken away. And the people that are putting them up, look at the theme that's coming through, right? 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 Now, the people who say that they're resourceful or no problem, I would challenge you to think if one of your strengths really included that sense of resourcefulness, because we're taking them away. As you can see by all the things up here, right? All the things up here. This is what happens to anyone who cannot use their signature strengths or their top strengths. When you can't do and be who you were meant to be, something goes wrong. This is really important. I want you to think about the people you know who are sad, who are depressed, who are anxious. Look at all the words that are up here. Instead of trying to see them as something is wrong with them, a way to understand what's happening is that they're not able to use their strengths, right? And I'm going to have to stop to share my screen to come on back here for a moment and take this part away. And if you give me just a moment, I will pull these back up. And we are now back here, right? So let me get the screen shared. Thank you for giving me that moment. And we're going to play from that slide. Yes. And can I just get a thumbs up that that worked? We're back on the slide. Good thing. It's always the technology. So what you can see from this, right, is that when our strengths are thwarted in any way, it jams us. And some of the new research, some of the things that are really hot and are coming out now is that it's not just about our strengths, it's about our capacity to use them in the right way. So when we see all the symptoms of things that aren't being used, right? If you take a look at this chart, we have a new model for mental health, a new model for education. Our job should be to find circumstances that will allow us to use our strengths in the best possible way. Or if we're in a position where we're teachers or creators of environments for our children, for the people we love, to create an environment where they can thrive by using their strengths, that becomes our goal. This chart is magnificent, and a lot of research has now started to move to this understanding that if we can't use our strengths, something negative tends to happen, right? So let's come back and talk about number 5 of the 7 decisions that people make. That people create challenging goals, right? And this is also a way of understanding that they do that because they're able to do this recalibration. That comes back to the one dish idea. You might not have control over lots of things, but if you recalibrate, you start finding micro goals, small goals that you can move towards that start to fill you up. And in number 6, that people are drawn to purpose and meaning. They start finding meaning in their life. There's a phenomenon known as post traumatic growth, which means that after 9/11, they studied the people who were shoulder to shoulder with one another, and about 25% got post-traumatic stress disorder. About 50% were naturally resilient, but another 25% used that experience as a catapult into improving their well-being. In other words, they said, this is a wake-up call. Just because something bad happened doesn't mean I have to succumb to it. I can rise above it. And finally, what we notice is that people low in hope choose isolation, whereas people high in hope cherish relationships. So here are the 7 all collapsed, right? They see things as fixed and possibilities. If you look on the far right, you can see what the high hope people tend to do. They are constantly seeking ways to improve their positivity. This is what generates hopefulness, right? Just a quick review. I've put this together to help people understand that the interventions that we're talking about, and we've seen a couple of them tonight, have to do with the past, the present, and the future. I always encourage people to start with gratitude because gratitude's the low hanging fruit in positive psychology. It's already taken place. We just didn't harvest the positivity from it. So you can start with gratitude. And what we know is that brings us more into the present. It makes people kinder, believe it or not. If you learn how to express gratitude on a regular basis, we know it improves and facilitates kindness. And then we see that this stuff improves if we're very present with our positivity. This starts to create an optimistic future, a hopeful future, a faith informed or an intentional, inspirational future. Um, Finally, as we get to this, to understand that in resilience, it's the belief system that really changes the consequence. It's the activating event, a belief, and then a consequence. And what we're seeing here is that there's lots of ways to influence our reaction to something. What we've been focusing on today in particular is the idea of cultivating hopefulness. Um, my encouragement is pick 1 or 2 of these areas to intentionally make different choices over the next week. And what that will start to do is if you take like Monday, look for positivity. Uh, you know, Tuesday, you go out and you start looking for the good. 3 on Wednesday, you find what'll start to happen is these become second nature to you. So what we're talking about is the thriving of the unsapped science of hope, and these are the takeaways for right now. The first is that I'll encourage you to do that gratitude review. Jot down what you did the day before that you have gratitude for. Do that 3 times a day, 3 times a week with 3 gratitudes. Recalibrate your goals. If you take a swing and a miss at something, if something didn't happen, recalibrate. Wash your one dish, right? And find ways to express gratitude, kindness, and compassion as often as you can, and cherish the relationships we have. We're studying loneliness now, and how powerful even one relationship, one friendship can be. I'm going to bring this to a close for this portion of it right now by saying I have a whole bunch of these interventions, 21-day hope challenge. I'll be able to talk more about that in the future. And if you text hopeful to 44222, you'll get an opt-in that will give you access to the articles and information about hope.
Thank you, Dr. Tomasulo. We appreciate it. You really did share so much helpful information, and it's amazing how quickly you really did help us change our perception and start to look at things in a different way. We do have a couple of questions. We have a couple of minutes for questions. Somebody asked, right now in our current state of the world, I think people are starting to feel a little bit more hopeful with things, but I think it's also mixed with some fearfulness and apprehension. And I'm just wondering, how can we manage those two things at once, trying to become more hopeful, but still having some fears and apprehensions?
Yeah, what a great question. If I can, I'm going to go a little bit Zen on you here, right? Because just the fact that you have both implies that there is a true self that's holding both. If there's a me that can appreciate I can be fearful and I can be hopeful, the me that has the capacity to hold both is who I want to give the keys to the bus to. Because what it means is that I have choice. The people who have the capacity to make the decisions I just spoke about are the people who recognize that I could be fearful or I could be hopeful. Which one am I going to choose? You know, the Native American story about I have two wolves inside, right? I'm sure everybody knows that story. You know, the one that is fear and the other one is hope, and there's all versions of the story. And it gets asked, well, which one wins? The one you feed. And so that means that you can feed one emotion or the other. And the key to that is understanding you are holding and knowing both, which means there's the self that has that capacity.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Another one is, as we start to develop the skills and learn how to change our perceptions, how can we maybe help others around us cultivate it as well? If we're noticing that we feel like some of our loved ones could use a little boost in their maybe hope muscle, what can we do?
Yeah, that's great. And these days I hang around all kinds of positive people, we're just positive, positive, positive. But what's really important to remember is that everybody is kind of on their own path, in their own time, in their own journey. There would be nothing more aggravating than for me to be telling somebody who's in a bad place, oh, look on the bright side, or have some gratitude, or trying to impose a perception on them. What would be important in the beginning, if you're working with somebody that is a little bit negative, is to hold the space around them. So that they feel safe enough to have the negative feelings, because that will give them enough confidence not to have to keep having them. They can put them down if they know that they're being heard and attended to. That becomes a really powerful way of you letting them release it, right? There's a way of understanding this. I try to teach my students who want to be therapists. It's like, if you're a therapist and you've got a 6-ounce cup of water and somebody comes to you with a full tablespoonful of salt and they put it in your water, everything tastes like salt, right? But if you can become a lake and you can be expansive about being able to hold that pain, that salt doesn't have as much of a sting to it anymore. In fact, it's almost imperceptible when there's an acknowledgement. Then you listen very carefully, because people will tell you there's something called a positive deviant, which basically means if somebody says, I'm depressed all the time, I have trouble sleeping, I can't sleep at all. I don't spend a lot of time listening to all that. I do want to hear it, but what I'm more interested in is, are there any times of the day where you don't feel that depressed. No, I feel it all the time. Oh, wait a minute. When I spend time with my niece and nephew, boy, that really fills me up. Now what you have is the positive deviant. Oh, so being around family fills you up. Oh, yeah, I never thought of it that way. Of course, because the way our minds are set is that we're going to make that error, that distortion of thinking everything is bad. Look at what you did when you tried to remember yesterday. You didn't remember the good parts. So part of it is to help them recognize that within all the negativity, there was still something there, because now you put them in conflict with themselves, not with you, not with a principle. You say, well, you said it was 100%, but what you just told me is that there were 20 minutes out of the day that you actually felt good. Were there any other times? Oh, I take a hot bath at night. That feels good. Okay, so now we got two things. So you start helping them learn what it is that's already there, and you amplify that.
Okay. And although we could go on asking you questions all night, I know that you've had a really long day of teaching. So we're going to end with one more question. But I do just want to mention to everyone watching that after Dr. Tomasulo answers our last question, our executive director of Westboro Connects is going to come on to say a few words. And then stay tuned, because Dr. Tomasulo has a great video to kind of send us off on our way in a hopeful way. So thank you so much. We really appreciate your time. And our last question is for the people who are ready to get started, how long would you say on average it really takes to become more hopeful, to really cultivate that hope? Can it start with the simple steps? How long until we notice a change maybe in ourselves or those around us?
The opening line to the first draft of my book, which is now, I think, the opening line of the first chapter, was hope is never further away than your next thought. It starts with your next thinking. It's not like, oh, I got to do some deep knee bends first, or get ready, or, I got to call somebody for it. No, 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 no. It's right this second. Your thinking is like the front wheels of a car. You point it in this direction, they're going in this direction. It starts with your very next thought. And I can't emphasize that enough. Uh, my work with people from every walk of life and every situation you can imagine. This is the information. It starts with your very next thought, not tomorrow, not next week, your next thought.
Thank you, Dr. Tomasulo, for all that you shared. This was my second time seeing your program, and I learned a lot tonight. I learned a lot the first night. I'm thrilled that many more people got to hear you tonight.
Thank you.
My name is Kelly Petralia, and I'm the Executive Director of Westboro Connects. On behalf of myself and my fellow programming chairs for this event, Laura and Megan, who you heard from earlier, we wish to thank you all for joining us tonight. For those of you who have registered for tonight's program, we will send a follow-up email soon with program notes and a curated list of additional resources, including information on Dr. Tomasulo's new book, Learned Hopefulness. Thank you to Westboro TV for always being with us and for broadcasting this on our local TV stations for those who are unable to attend via Zoom. Thank you to our volunteers, Aileen and Kate, for helping us with tonight's Zoom. The past 12 plus months have tested even the most optimistic among us, but we believe that coming together to celebrate things, such as Spring Kindness Week a few weeks ago, while also tackling the tougher stuff like mental health and racism, are what will help us get through as a connected community. We will never go back to exactly the way things were before COVID-19, but we can bounce forward together to what is ahead. We believe Dr. Tomasulo's words will be helpful now and as we move into the future. We were thrilled to co-host this program with the Westboro Public Library. We also wish to thank the amazing Westboro Civic Club for the additional funding they provided, which made this evening possible. Westboro Connects is also grateful for the support from Westboro Public Schools, as well as a community grant from Reliant Foundation to support our ongoing work in the community. If you are able and wish to support future community programming events like these, which are always free to attend but cost money to produce, please consider a donation to Westboro Connects. a local grassroots nonprofit focused on kindness, connection, and community resilience. You'll find the link to our PayPal in the chat, and you can also find it as well as additional programming information, newsletters, and community resources on our website, westboroughtconnects.org. Finally, please remember to fill out our feedback form from this evening. We appreciate your input very much, and it helps us with our future program planning, including topics that would be of interest to you for us to share in the future. Thank you again, Dr. Tomasulo. My dog says thank you, and have a good evening, and look forward to you taking us out with that video.
Thanks very much. I'm going to share my screen. And I'll just say as I start this, because of the book and writing it, I got to meet a lot of people, not the least of which was some of the people involved in what you're about to see.
Brass bullet casings turned into an instrument of hope. 2 students, survivors of the Parkland, Florida mass shooting, joined by 71 musicians, honoring the victims and survivors of gun violence by performing their song, Shine. You threw my city away. You tore down the walls and opened up all the gates. You ruined this town. You burned all of the bridges and you slowly let us drown. But you're not gonna knock us down. We'll get back up again. You may have hurt us, but I promise we'll be stronger. And we're not gonna let you in. We're putting up a fight. You may have brought the dark, but together we will shine the light. And whoa, we will be something special. Whoa, we're gonna shine. We're gonna stand tall. Gonna raise up our voices so we'll never, ever fall. We're done with all your little games. We're tired of hearing that we're too young to ever make a change. 'Cause you're not gonna knock us down. We'll get back up again. You may have hurt us, but I promise we'll be stronger. And we're not gonna let you in. We're putting up a fight. You may have brought the dark, but together we will shine the light. We can hug a little tighter. We can love a little more. Laugh a little harder. We can stand up and roar. We all come together, it will be alright. Stand up for one another and we'll never give up.
and healing through the arts. Join us. Instrumentofhope.org.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good evening.